All right, good morning, Capre. This is Pastor Chris, and I am bringing you week 2 in our series, Back to the Beginning. Now, what we've been doing in this series is taking a look at the first chapter of each of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just kind of asking, why did they begin their story the way that they did? And this, of course, is prompted by Christmas, which is the beginning of the story of Jesus. But this week's a little odd. See, both Matthew and Luke record what we typically call the Christmas story, the birth narrative. And even John has his own kind of poetic version of that. But Mark doesn't. Mark's gospel just starts right out with Jesus in his 30s beginning his ministry. It skips right over his childhood, right over his adolescence, right over his 20s, and into his 30s. If Jesus had been at a Thanksgiving gathering last week, he would have had an aunt hovering over him, asking when he is going to settle down, and his dad would have probably been bothering him about when he was going to finally buy a home. Like, that is the phase of life that Jesus is in when Mark begins. So for a Christmas series, this week's a bit of a challenge because there's no Christmas story. But we're going to try to tackle it anyway. And to do that, I want to actually tell you about one of my favorite places. It's a park in St. Louis called Forest Park. It's just on kind of the west edge of the city, and it's beautiful. It's huge. In fact, it's actually bigger than Central Park in New York City, and I just love going there. If you get a chance, there's a lot of stuff to do. There's a zoo, there's an art museum, there's a science center. It's all free. There are great running trails, and it's gorgeous. And I love going, but I also love the history of it. See, the park was built in 1904 for the World's Fair. Now, back then, the World's Fair was a big deal. Obviously, they didn't have the internet or TV. Even radio and newspapers was pretty limited. There wasn't anything national to where news was passed around quickly. And so this was an opportunity for people all over the world to gather and learn about new cultural things, new scientific advancements, and just what's going on in the world. And so different cities have hosted this throughout the years. Not too long before St. Louis, it was in Chicago in 1893. And then in 1904, it comes to St. Louis, and they build Forest Park in preparation for that. And they built a ton of different structures on the property. They wanted to show off their city and show the rest of the world that they were legit. And so they built all of this stuff, and some of it is still standing today. And one of the buildings that is the one that I want to talk about, and it's called the Palace of Electricity. And they built a big pond in front of it, and it was magnificent. In fact, here is a picture of it right here. And yeah. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. Now, this building was lined with lights on the outside, electric lights. Now, the light bulb had been invented 20, 30 years before by Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, but it still wasn't widely used. There were some places where it was used outside, but it wasn't something available to just normal people. So homes were still lit by candlelight or by gas lantern, which are both flame-based. And so the idea of this constantly on light was new to people. Like, it was possible to go through a good portion of life never having seen one. And I think that's why this building is so fascinating to me. It's just this idea of not having seen that and then walking up and seeing those lights reflecting down on the water, just illuminating everything, and just how mysterious that would have seemed. But it was there, in the Palace of Electricity, that one of the new advancements was presented that would change the world. And that is what went on to become the common light bulb, a light bulb that could be commercially purchased and owned by regular people. And like I said, we take that for granted. Just this past couple years, I've replaced all the light bulbs in our home with smart bulbs, and so I spend half of my day yelling at Alexa to turn them on or off, and we fight a lot. And I apologize if you have an Amazon device in your home. I just probably triggered it, and I'm sorry. But we take for granted that we have light everywhere. But this development let people have light whenever they wanted it in their homes. Now, how does this relate to anything in the Gospel of Mark? Well, see, if the invention was just the invention, if the advancement in the light bulb hadn't happened, it would have just been a cool invention. You'd go, you'd see it, you'd marvel at it, and then you'd go home, but it wouldn't make any real tangible difference in your life. The invention wouldn't have mattered if it didn't intervene into regular people's lives, like it did with the light bulb. And I think that the Christmas story, the birth narrative, is kind of the same way. We gather together to marvel at it. We celebrate it every year at Christmas because it's an incredible story, packed with incredible things. But if that's all it is, it's just a cool story. If the coming of Christ doesn't become something that affects our lives on a daily basis, then it's just a cool story. And I think that's why I like the fact that Mark is kind of wedged between Matthew and Luke that have the Christmas stories, because Mark reminds us that Jesus, well, it's more than just the story of a baby in a manger and a man on a cross. It's the story of a Savior that walked among us, teaching us how to live. And so I like the reminder that is the first chapter of the book of Mark, that Jesus came for a reason. And if we let that reason into our lives, it's not just a cool story, but it changes us and it changes the world around us. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and dive in to the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 1 begins like this. This is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, I'm going to stop right there. I know I'm half a verse in, but just hang with me. I love that Mark begins with that phrase, this is the good news. Now, the word traditionally there is gospel, but if you translate gospel literally, what you get is good news. And I think built into that is an important reminder for us as Christians. I like to play a little bit of a game. I love when I meet new people. Most of them don't just immediately assume that I'm a pastor. I don't have a traditional pastor look. At least I don't think that I do. So most people don't guess that. And I love seeing how long I can go in a conversation before I have to mention it. Or I look for like the most awkward moment to mention it, and then I drop it. And I don't know why, but I get a kick out of that. And a good example of this was a few weeks ago. I went to get my hair cut at a place called Scissors and Scotch. I am a Baptist, don't tell my dad. But while I was there, a lady was cutting my hair. It was the first time I'd seen her before. And so we were just chatting about life. And at one point, she said a bad word. And then she was a little worried. She was like, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And I was like, right, I don't give a damn. Just keep going with the story. And she did, and we laughed. And she went on, and I don't even know how it happened. But in telling me her story, she began to talk about religion and her family and the tradition that she grew up with, but how that tradition, that religion had rejected her. And you could tell that there was a lot of trauma there. And so as she began to speak about the faith and Christians, you could tell that it was a not great topic for her. And so I listened and I took it in. And then we got to kind of the end of our time together, and she pauses and she goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't even ask, what do you do?" And I was like, "Well, I'm a pastor." And you could just see the dread go over her face, recounting everything she had said. And I just stopped her and I said, "You don't have to apologize. I agree with you. We need to do better. We need to change and we need to do better. And that's why I'm a pastor, because I believe the best way to bring about that change is from the inside out." But it was such a reminder that when a lot of people hear Christianity or think about Christianity, it's not good news. Now, I've been listening to a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's about a church in the Northeast in Seattle that in the early 2000s started and grew very big. They had a pretty well-known pastor named Mark Driscoll, and they had several campuses and thousands of people attending. And then almost overnight, the whole thing fell apart. And there was a lot of abuse that had taken place in the leadership. And this podcast is diving into that. And it's been a hard listen as people have recounted the trauma they had experienced. And in the last episode, the host, he's been really insightful, but he asked the question, what was the gospel they were preaching? What was the message they were sending out into the world? And I've been thinking about that. What is the message we're sending out into the world? What is the gospel we're preaching? And is it good news? Because I would say this, if our good news isn't good news, then it's not good news. It's not gospel. It's not Christianity. If the message that we bring to people out there isn't good, if it's a message that beats people down or makes people feel more rejected, then it's not good news. It's not gospel. It's not Christianity. Now, the message that we are called to share, the message that Mark starts his gospel reminding us about, is good news. It brings hope to the hopeless, light to the darkness. It's literally good news. And I love that he begins there. And then he goes on. He says, it began just as the prophet Isaiah had written. Isaiah was a prophet in the Old Testament, and he had told these words about what would happen. He says, look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way. He is a voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord's coming, clear a road for him. It says this messenger was John the Baptist. He was in the wilderness and preached that people should be baptized to show that they had repented of their sins and turned to God to be forgiven. And it goes on. In verse 7, it says, John announced, someone is coming soon who is greater than I am. So much greater that I'm not even worthy to stoop down like a slave and untie the straps of his sandals. Now, how many of you out there, click the heart button if you have raised a small child? Now, how many of you have had that experience where that child is old enough to do it themselves, but they plop their butt down, they stick their foot out, and they tell you, not ask you, they tell you to untie their shoe for them? It's humbling. And John says, I'm not even worthy to do that to Jesus. He says, I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. John continues. He says, one day Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee, and John baptized him in the Jordan River. As Jesus came up out of the water, he saw the heavens splitting apart, and the Holy Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice from heaven said, "You are dearly loved, my dearly loved Son, and you bring me great joy." Then it says that Jesus went out into the wilderness and he spent 40 days being tempted by Satan. And he resisted that temptation. And then when he came back, he was ready to begin his public ministry. And this is how he did that. It says, one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed him. And this goes on, and they gather more disciples up. Then it says in verse 21. Now, let me tell you, if you are somebody who struggles to pay attention, this is your gospel. Mark is constantly moving, constantly jumping to the next section. We are still just halfway through chapter 1. It says, Jesus and his companions went into the town of Capernaum. When the Sabbath day came, they went into the synagogue and they began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of religious law. It says, suddenly a man in the synagogue who possessed an evil spirit cried out, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? You have come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus reprimanded him. "Be quiet. Come out of the man," he ordered. And at that, the evil spirit screamed, threw the man into a convulsion, and came out of him. And the people were absolutely astonished. They were amazed. And then it moves on. It says in verse 29, after Jesus left the synagogue with James and John, they went to Simon and Andrew's home. Now Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. Now keep in mind, back at this time, life expectancy wasn't super long, and a high fever was often a terminal illness. It says they told Jesus about her right away. So he went to her bedside, took her by the hand, and helped her sit up. Then the fever left her, and she prepared a meal for them. I love that. This woman has to be from the South, because here she is in bed, dying of a high fever. They heal it, and she immediately gets up, starts baking a pie. Crazy. I love it. And then it goes on. It says, after sunset, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. The whole town gathered at the door to watch, so Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases. He cast out many demons. It was just crazy. These crowds are developing. And then it goes on into the next section. Verse 35. Before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Now I want to stop there. This is a little mini sermon in the midst of the big sermon here. Call it a little sampler, like those little things of like makeup my wife gets and then is sad when they run out. That's what this is. It's a little sampler sermon here. But there are 3 words in that last little part I read that I want us to pay attention to. Isolated place and pray. Jesus went to an isolated place to pray. Now, we live in a culture that does not like isolated places. We are constantly around others. Things are constantly moving forward. We live in a world that makes it hard to often be alone and in silence when we want to be. If you're a parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have hid in the bathroom before attempting to find this. And so oftentimes we just skip over it. We don't have an isolated place, much less an isolated place that we can pray. But if Jesus, the Son of God, needs to go to an isolated place and pray, then we do too. If Jesus needs to do that before he can get to work, we do too. So I encourage you to look for a place that you can make your isolated place to pray. Maybe it's just a corner of your house. Maybe it's a trail that you walk in the mornings, but find that place and go there and pray. It says later, Simon and the others went out to find him. When they found them, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." But Jesus replied, "We must go to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That is why I came." See, I think this is what links it to the Christmas story, to the birth narrative. Jesus is saying this preaching, sharing good news, that's why I'm here. That's why I was born. So he traveled throughout the region of Galilee, preaching in synagogues and casting out demons. He jumps into the next section, verse 40. A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean, he said. It says, moved with compassion. Now, in my Bible, there's an asterisk after the word compassion, indicating that there's a footnote. And if you go down and read it, it says, some manuscripts read, moved with anger. So some of the copies of this that we have say moved with compassion. Some of the copies say moved with anger. It reminds me of this part in John that I've talked about before, where Jesus, as he's weeping, he expresses emotion, but the term, it's hard to translate because it's like it doesn't know what emotion it is. It's just this kind of burst of feeling. And I wonder if that's what happened here, and that's why people had a hard time pinning down exactly what it was. And I think that's kind of powerful. You know, sometimes we see Jesus as this kind of stoic figure that doesn't feel emotion. And here he sees this person who's suffering, who's been rejected because of their suffering, and he feels all this feeling inside of him. It says, Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said, be healed. Instantly, the leprosy disappeared and the man was healed. And then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. And here we're going to see a pattern begin, a pattern that carries out throughout the Gospel of Mark. And I want to take a minute to talk about it. It says in verse 44, this is Jesus speaking. Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. So Jesus says, don't tell everybody about what has happened. And then the next verse. But the man went out and spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. Like literally the opposite of what Jesus said. It says, as a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anywhere. He had to stay in secluded places, but the people from everywhere kept coming to him. So you have this pattern of Jesus saying, don't tell anyone about this, and then the person immediately telling everyone about this. In fact, the book of Mark ends with this pattern. A few years ago, Pastor Dan and I preached a series kind of like this one, but instead of taking a look at the first chapter, we took a look at the last chapter of each gospel and asked, why did the gospel writer wrap it up this way? Why did they end the story this way? And Mark is an interesting one because Mark doesn't just have one ending, it has three endings. The original ending, and then two that were added later because people felt uncomfortable with the original ending. Because this is what the original ending says. The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. Now, what I love about that is that it's not true. If it was true, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having this online service right now. We know that they went out and proclaimed to everybody that Jesus wasn't in the tomb. That's how the church started. The other gospels tell us that. But it's kind of this same pattern continuing. Don't tell anyone. And they told everyone. And we see it begin there in Mark 1. And you have to wonder why. Well, first of all, why did Jesus tell them not to tell anyone? Wouldn't he want them to know? And the answer, well, it's been debated. Different scholars have different opinions. Obviously, that's usually the case. Some think that Jesus was being humble. Some think that there's some deep complex theological reason behind it. I actually think it's much simpler than that. I think Jesus knew that his message was going to upset certain people, that the kingdom he was preaching about would be in conflict with the kingdoms that were already on earth. That his message was going to threaten people in positions of authority. And he knew that when they felt threatened, they were going to come after him. And he knew, I think, that he was going to die. And I think Jesus wanted as much time as possible to preach the good news to as many people as he could. And so I think he was telling people that to slow down what he knew was inevitably going to happen. But people didn't do that. Why? Well, how many of you have ever tried to surprise your spouse, but you have kids, and one of them knew, and you knew that there was a good chance that the surprise was not going to happen, because when they get excited, they can't keep their mouth closed? Or how many of you have a friend who can't keep a secret? Just click the heart button, let me know if either one of those relate to you. It's hard when you're really excited to not talk about something. And each of these individuals, I think, were really excited for a very particular reason. See, we're in the midst of Advent. There are 4 weeks in Advent, and each week traditionally has a word that's associated with it. Last week was hope. This week is peace. And the opposite of peace is chaos. And we live in a world full of chaos. Turn on the news. I saw a tweet last week that basically said I'm torn between wanting to stay informed and know what's going on and not feeling an existential dread all the time. So I don't know how much I should check the news. I remember just a few years ago, after the 2016 election, I had started listening to a lot of political podcasts that were kind of breaking down and analyzing everything that had happened. And so I was listening to 3 or 4 a week, and they were deep diving into everything that was going on in the world. And there was one day I was sitting at my desk in there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I felt so overwhelmed. But what was crazy was like, you know what? I'm going to listen to a different podcast. I'm going to listen to a true crime podcast about a murder, because somehow that would be less stressful than hearing about what's going on in the world. That's how much chaos there is out there, especially at this time of year. It's kind of ironic. The season of Advent is usually a season of preparation or waiting. Those are the 2 words kind of associated with it. I don't know about you, but I do not feel like I'm waiting or preparing. I feel more like I'm panicking in a mad rush. How many of you, like me, click the heart button if when you walk into Walmart and you see that sign that tells you how many days are left until Christmas, you begin to develop a weird twitch? Anybody? Yeah, this is a season of more chaos on top of the normal chaos that we're already experiencing. You know, some of us are experiencing mental chaos. Maybe you deal with depression or anxiety or ADHD or OCD or something else. Maybe it's emotional chaos. Maybe some of you have gone through a difficult breakup, or you're dealing with a broken relationship in your family. For some of us, it's physical. Maybe you're dealing with an ailment or a sickness that you never thought you'd be dealing with. It's turned your life upside down. Or maybe it's somebody in your life and you're trying to be there and support them, and it's chaos. Maybe it's spiritually. Maybe you're at a place in your faith where you're deconstructing or trying to figure out what you believe, and it's chaos. So many of us are experiencing chaos, just like the people in these stories. An evil spirit, a high fever, leprosy, rejection, chaos. And in each one of these stories, Jesus enters in to their lives and brings peace. He brings some level of peace to the chaos. No wonder they're excited. No wonder they want to tell everybody. I would too. And that's the good news. That's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus was born. That's what the Christmas story, the birth narrative, leads to. If it doesn't, it's just a cool story. But if we let it into our lives, if we let the message of Jesus, the good news, go home with us, it's not just a crazy invention, it's a light bulb, a light that we can take back home. And that's something we want to tell everybody about. So I think this chapter in Mark leaves us with, well, two things. One, I think some of us need that peace. We're living in chaos and we need it. And if that's you, Jesus is offering it. And we're here to help you find it. If you're struggling this morning, you can click that prayer button and one of our leaders, we will message you back and we will talk to you. We'll get back to you, ask how we can pray for you, how we can help bring the peace of Jesus into the chaos of your life. But number two, we want to share that peace with others. You know, we are preparing for our Christmas Eve services. We do them in a barn. The barn at Kill Creek Farm, it's this beautiful facility. People use it for weddings and stuff. It's paved, it's heated, it's beautiful. And it's just, I think, a great place to go and remember what Christmas is all about, the humbleness of where it all started in a manger. And especially with COVID and stuff this year, it's kind of a good atmosphere because it's still a little bit outside. There's really high ceilings, and I think it's a little safer place to gather. And so we're inviting everybody to come join us. Plus, we're going to be doing an online version of it. And our hope is to share the peace of Jesus with as many people as possible because we know that their lives are full of chaos. And so we've got an online registration where people can go and reserve a seat because it fills up quick in the barns. And we've got services at 1, 3, 5, 7, and 11. And if they fill up, we'll add more. But the whole reason that we are doing it is to share that peace. Hope to the hopeless, light to the darkness. Good news. So I encourage you, you'll see a link in the chat to the Facebook event. You'll see a link in the chat to how to reserve a seat. But I want you to go out there and I want you to invite everybody you can. Not so that it's full and exciting. I mean, that is true. I would love for it to be packed and exciting. But because I think that there are people who are living in chaos that need peace. And that's what Jesus has come to offer us. That's what the Christmas story, the birth narrative is all about. Not just a cool story, not just a cool baby in a manger, but a gospel that goes home with us and changes our lives. Thanks for joining us this morning.